Hello, my name is Thomas and welcome to the fourth video in this series and the third book review. So far I've talked about my sunglasses, I've talked about Martin Amis's Time's Arrow, which was a novel I probably wouldn't otherwise have read. It was very interesting, very artistic. I read A Brilliant Darkness and reviewed it, and this is the one that I was most looking forward to, about a disappeared scientist. Lots of facts, lots of science understanding. This is the one I expected to enjoy the most. And then a book which really is more my normal kind of reading. It's called Postwar by Tony Judt, who was born in London. He's a British academic who's also worked in the United States. It's a history of Europe since 1945. I found this to be deeply, deeply interesting. I'm not sure what exactly I was expecting. I do read a lot of history, and it's a particularly interesting part of history. It's one that relates to most of us in our daily lives. It is, I say, a history of Europe. It's very, very focused on this. There are occasional notes, I feel, especially for American readers. Again, he's lectured in the United States, but I found that very revealing for myself, coming from the UK, to see what Europeans might understand from their experience, what Americans might understand from their experience about the Great War and the period that followed. But it does start with the Great War and the Second World War, really. But again, what terms he applies can change because those terms are all contested. So this isn't a simple 5 things we can learn from this period. It's not postulating a particular idea. It's got a lot of depth, a lot of complexity. I just made a few bookmarks really at the beginning. I don't like to go into any spoilers whatsoever for any book, even though I know for a history book we all know how it ends. But he's describing some of the challenges. So, for example, post-war Italy. When we're looking back, we often think of heroic partisans fighting against the fascist occupiers. But he doesn't really accept those definitions at face value. It's not to say he believes they don't exist, but he likes to go a little bit deeper. So for example, as late as 1960 in Italy, 62 out of the 64 prefects responsible for Italy's provincial administration had held office under fascism, as had all 135 police chiefs. So when he's talking about Nazi occupation and how Europe recovers from that, he's actually describing this in many ways as a civil war in a lot of European countries. He describes the occupation of France as being relatively light, around 1,500 troops, I believe he says, for most of the occupation, for about 30 million French. So then he's talking about the French resistance, often fighting against Frenchmen who had sided with what, again, looking back, we'd just call the Nazi regime, but is often looking at the communist threat at the time, which had existed before the Second World War. We're very familiar with the Cold War, continuing on from, say, 45 until about 1990. But he's looking at the deeper roots of all this. He doesn't really have a particular starting date, although it's post-45. He's willing to look back. For example, the creation of Britain's welfare state, the creation of Britain's National Health Service. Okay, it's 48. But he's looking back at the Beveridge report and how Beveridge himself had his experience shaped being the son of a judge in British India. He's looking at the 19th century liberal ideas in Britain and then how that affected the post-Second World War state. I found this to be one of the most interesting ones. I haven't finished it, which I normally would like to for a book review, but really because I kept pausing to stop and think, to reflect upon it. Because again, he doesn't take a very simple narrative. Most people would take one simple thread and hang their facts upon it, but he really questions the historical narrative. Again, not that he's a contrarian, not that he's trying to reinvent the wheel, but that he's adding a great deal of depth to a story that I think we all should be familiar with, perhaps not always familiar with. Something that I find really interesting about this book is how he deals with Eastern Europe and their legacy of the Second World War. So many Eastern European countries had really strived for independence, for example against the Turks in the 19th century. Nationalism had risen towards the late 19th century and early 20th century, as a lot of us know from the history of the First World War. And that came under threat as communism became more and more widespread, as it gained power. And during the Second World War, there were many in Eastern Europe who joined with the Nazi occupiers, as we tend to see them, because Well, that seemed to be the only route for what they considered freedom, which was their national freedom. So when we talk about Nazi occupation, collaborators, resistance fighters, what Tony Judt really says is that frankly it's just a lot more complicated than that. He doesn't throw all narratives out the window, he's not actually trying to disprove everything for the sake of doing so, but I think he adds a great deal of depth to say who were these people that in the modern day it's very easy to look back at and say these people were cowardly collaborators, but the thing about a civil war, as he points out, is that after the war you have to live with your neighbour, and that's a very important dynamic to the post-war era. So again, this is, for me, one of the most interesting books. It's one that I'd read and reread, and I think I'd get something more out of it every time because the ideas are simply that interesting. Again, looking at James Bond's perspective on this, I think he's somebody who's very interested in conflict, but also perhaps the legacy of conflict. Now he's in retirement, looking at, we've had the war, now what? If you're familiar with the writing of Ian Fleming, you'll know the line about how heroes and villains can seem to change places as we get older. And I think this book really touches upon that. Again, without trying to say nothing is true or without trying to say there are no answers, but giving a great deal of depth to the answers that we have. So out of the 3 books, this has actually been my favourite. Perhaps you'll enjoy it too.